Thanks for inviting me along today, although I did hear the last couple of minutes of your previous speaker and I didn't bring gifts, I don't have a fancy PowerPoint, and I did hear some laughing, and I've got this straight after lunch session, so thanks a lot for that, that's great. And I've got what some would say is a rather boring topic, but there we go. I've got a few notes and I've got a few questions from you guys, so I'm happy to run through that, but if anyone's got any questions, just call out, put your hand up or whatever, and we can try and answer things as we go. So I've been asked just to explain what is a private certifier. It's reasonably simple. We basically assess your plans, and if we think they're up to scratch, then we issue a building consent. I'm not sure how many of you are sort of acting out in the profession at the moment or in the field and actually going through the process of submitting applications for approvals and that sort of thing. Have you covered the development approval process? Are you aware of what's involved? Not a lot? Okay. So in basic terms, for someone to start building a development, they need a development approval. Usually that's made up of two separate consents. The first part is a development plan consent, or we still often call it a planning consent. You do need to go to council in most cases for that, and they'll look at your proposal based on the council development plan. So that'll cover things like what's the purpose of the building, what does it look like, how much of the site are you covering. For commercial properties, we'll look at things like car parking and signage and all those sorts of things. So the first stage of your approval process is usually to get that development plan consent. The second part is the building consent. And in really simple terms, we look at the building code and just look at your plans and work out whether it all complies. And hopefully everything's good. We issue a building consent and then council can issue the development approval. So if you like, we're sort of the second part of the approval process. So have some of you sort of used certifiers or submitted applications to councils? No, it's all new. Fantastic. So I can tell you anything, really, can't I? No, good. So I probably won't bore you too much about what we need, but ultimately what we need to know is what is it that you're building, how are you going to build it, and can you give me enough information that I can check that it meets the building code and all the relevant standards and things that go with that. We could talk about that for hours and hours, but that's not why we're here today. But in a nutshell, that's what we do. So, particularly for domestic construction, one of the most confusing things we deal with is bushfire requirements. It sounds really simple. If you're in a bushfire zone, build your houses so they're reasonably bushfire resistant. That part of it's really simple. From then on, it just gets more complicated. The bushfire legislation has been around for quite a while now, but certainly early days when it first came out, I would seriously say to architects, if you're reading the bushfire legislation for the first time and it makes sense, you've missed something, because it is stupidly complicated. It's combined with the Development Act, the development regulations, there's a minister's specification, there's also the building code, there's an Australian standard, there were variations to the building code which affected the standard, and you're also dealing with planning legislation and building legislation. You've also got some planning requirements that we need to check at the building stage. So if you can find any other part of a building or a design process that involves more than that, I'd be curious to know, because I haven't found one yet. So what we'll try and do, after doing a few talks here, I've actually come up with a flowchart which sort of makes sense, I hope. But I can't do a PowerPoint because it's literally all just scribble, so that's why the whiteboard's here. So the two main things we're looking at for bushfire protection is how you actually construct the building to make it bushfire resistant. Now, we're not saying it's bushfire proof. So if you're talking to your clients and they say, I want a building that's guaranteed to be there after the fire goes through, be very careful. What the standard talks about is providing an environment where people can perhaps shelter for a short period of time as the fire front goes through, and then come out of the building and hopefully they're still all okay. Can't guarantee how their building's going to be, all right? Traditionally, yeah, I reckon I'm about the oldest one here. Traditionally, the bushfire legislation was based on the fact that fires come through, they go through very quickly, so all you need to do is jump inside your house for a few minutes, the fire goes past, you come outside, you might have a few little spot fires you put out, and everything's fantastic. What we discovered from particularly the Victorian fires a few years ago is that theory doesn't stand up in large fires. I'm not sure if any of you have actually looked at some of the stuff from those fires, it's quite scary. But just the temperatures and the speeds involved, sheltering inside a house wasn't a good idea for a lot of people. So it's very hard to talk about this without sounding a bit sort of morbid. But a lot of those people, their best bet would have been just get out of there, be somewhere completely different. So that's why a lot of your stuff you see on TV and that from the CFS now, it's all about evacuation and getting out, and that's still really good sense. I had a chat with a CFS guy one day about when is the best time to evacuate, and he seriously said to me, October. So their sort of attitude is get out of there, don't be there if there's a fire, which is probably a little bit off topic. So what we're trying to do in relation to how you design buildings, and specifically we're talking residential buildings, so we're talking houses and also class 2 and 3 buildings. We're not talking commercial buildings, we're not talking offices, factories, those sorts of things. So we're looking at saving people's homes and particularly the people that are in them. So the two requirements I've just mentioned, we need to look at protecting the building. So we're trying to make the buildings reasonably fire resistant with no guarantees, but we're also looking at providing water for firefighting. And this is where it starts getting complicated because the requirements for the water are triggered by planning issues, and your construction requirements could be triggered by planning but also by building. So if you can stick with me, I'll try and get this onto there. So the first step, are you in a bushfire zone? Oh. So to work out if you're in a bushfire zone, the technical way is you go to the development regulations and there's a schedule in there that gives you a whole list of all the councils that have bushfire zones in their development plan. Actually, does everyone know what I mean when I say development plan? Lots of nods, okay. And then if the council is on that list and it says, yes, we do have bushfire zones, you need to look on the council development plan. There are physically maps in their plan which will tell you what area is a bushfire zone. So first step, am I in a bushfire zone? Does anyone think Marion Council's got any bushfire zone? Because we're in Marion here. Anyone know how far from the bushfire stuff we are right here? Just across that road. So if you're doing a job at St Mary's, potentially you're in a bushfire zone. I don't know about you, but how many would have thought that off the top of their head? No? So when I go through this, you might realise that you actually need to check it, but you don't need to do anything. But there's some really tricky areas that you look at and you go, well, I didn't even think that would be a bushfire zone. And we go, yes, it is. Okay, so first thing, is it in a bushfire zone? If it's no, that's fine, you're done. So if you look up the council and it's, I'm trying to think of a council that doesn't have bushfire zone. West Torrens. West Torrens has no bushfire zone, so that's as far as you go. It's not in the zone, don't need to worry about bushfire. Okay, so let's assume it's yes. Then we have to identify the zone. So in the council development plan, there's 4 different zones. This is where it gets confusing. There's a high zone, there's a medium zone, there's what's called general, and excluded. And that sort of makes sense. You'd think that means, you know, high risk, medium risk, not much risk, no risk. That would be. You want to see the bottom of the chart? So that's the easy bit so far. All right, I'll start with medium because this is probably the easier one. So in a medium zone, from a planning point of view, so I'll just put a P for planning. So you've got planning issues and building issues. Okay, so at a planning stage, you will need to provide water for firefighting. That's not water for the CFS to use, that's water for the homeowner to come out, quite literally to fill up buckets and throw it on a fire. All right, if the owners want to do more, that's great, that's up to them. But to meet the requirements, what they need is either a 5,000 litre tank or a 2,000 litre tank. And how this works is if it's a 5,000 litre tank, that can just be hooked up on the back of the shed, water, you know, your downpipe connected to it, it fills up the water, that's fine. If it's a 2,000 litre tank, because a lot of these properties don't have a lot of room, you can put in a 2,000 litre tank as long as you've got that tank connected to the mains with a float valve so it tops up. So as you're filling up your buckets, in theory, it's filling up at the top. Just like a toilet system basically, but a big one. People have different theories, but you can imagine in a bushfire, if everybody's got their tanks on and filling up, you're not going to be getting a lot of water back in your tank in a hurry. You hear these stories in a fire, someone goes to turn their hose on, they get this tiny little trickle. But that's the requirement. So under planning, you're looking at either a 5,000 litre tank or a 2,000 litre tank. just with a tap for filling up buckets. At building stage, I need to explain to you a term called a bushfire attack level. Okay, so there is an Australian standard on bushfire protection, which is AS 3959. Okay, and in that standard there is a process for assessing a site. It basically looks at, I have lots of trees, not very many trees, is it grass, how big are the trees, how far apart, and identifying the hazards around that site to determine a bushfire attack level. Okay, so depending on the bushfire attack level, that then dictates how we build our houses. So the bushfire attack levels, it starts at low, next one's 12.5, 19, 29, 40, and the really good one is what's called FZ or flame zone. So that bit makes sense too. So bow low means low risk, bow flame zone, that literally means if the tree next to the house catches fire, the flames will be licking the house and the ones are in between. Most of what we see, probably the first three, most, if you've got a site on flame zone, be really careful, okay, because it's really hard to build a house to meet flame zone requirements. All right, so I'm getting myself confused. So, council development plan says it's medium bushfire risk. Planning, we've worked out our tank. At building stage, it's BAL 12.5. Okay, so there's no negotiation, no discussion, it just is what it is. Okay, so at BAL 12.5, that means you're doing things like putting screens on your windows to stop sparks coming in, sealing up under the gaps under your roof to stop. It's all about stopping sparks coming in. There's restrictions on the glass in your windows if the glass go down to ground level, those sorts of things. So it's not a huge cost to most houses to build to BAL 12.5. So medium zone's nice and simple. Tank, bushfire constructions. In the general zone, again, we've got planning requirements and building requirements. So planning, we've got the same tank, either 5,000 or 2,000. Again, just with a tap for filling up buckets, it's okay. For building, it automatically becomes BAL low. And the good news is BAL low's now got a lot simpler because the new bushfire standard, the new 3959 came out this year. There are now no construction requirements in BAL low. Okay, last year we told you differently because there were requirements. Okay, so that's good. I'm going to work backwards. So in a high zone, how this works, when you submit your application to council, council will send your plans to the CFS. And that's part of a formal referral process. The CFS will look at the site and do the assessment to work this out. I mean, you can do that yourself if you like. Some people get engineers to do it, but we strongly suggest just let the CFS do it. CFS know what they're doing. There's been a few cases where we've had people do their own assessment or an engineer do it, and we send it off to the CFS anyway. It's just a double check sort of thing. So in a high zone, actually, yeah. So there'll be a CFS assessment. Okay, and that will give us our BAL rating. But that's done at planning stage. So we haven't got to the building requirements yet, but you have worked out your BAL rating, so that's good. And that all happens as part of the planning assessment. Okay, the other thing in the high zone, I think I've messed up my own graph here now. So the planning requirements are a much bigger tank, 22,000 litres. So that's one of those big things. 3-4 metres round, a couple of metres high maybe. I don't know the exact sizes. You need to have CFS fittings on it. Because the difference with this tank is this is for not only the homeowners to get water out of it and do their buckets, this is for the CFS to back their truck up to it, connect to it and suck the water out and fight a fire. Okay, so there's no point putting in a big tank without the CFS fittings because the CFS can't get the water. You also need pumps, you need fire hoses, and probably the thing that gets really tricky from a design point of view is you need to make sure the CFS can get to it. So I had a job come in the other day up in the hills, a rural site, reasonably steep, nice house, nice driveway. The tank's at the bottom of the hill at the back. So the first thing the CFS are going to say is, no, it's not. It's coming out the front so we can get to it. So these people have gone through their whole design process, got lovely house frontage, developed all their site, got it all worked out. And then we're going to say, but you've got to put a tank in front of that that's this big and this high. So just think about where the tank is going to go. Quite literally, the CFS have to be able to back up to it within about 6 metres. Okay, so there's a little bit of flexibility, but not much. So then from the BAL rating, that gives us our building requirements. So the BAL rating will be one of these. Does that make sense? Okay, we'll come back to that a little bit later. Right, the excluded zone. That sounds really simple, doesn't it? Excluded from bushfire, don't do anything. Normally you'd be right. So there are no requirements for tanks. So, I don't know if you can read my writing. No tank. Building, I'm going to say nothing, but then I'm going to put an asterisk next to it. So normally that would be the case. So if you look at one of these online maps and it's in an excluded zone, which are the grey ones, you'd look at it and go, beauty, I'm excluded, don't need to worry. And that's where some people get stuck. In the excluded zone, they've got what we call a buffer zone. So if you're in an excluded zone, but within half a kilometre of a high zone, you need to do something. Okay. When all this mapping was first done, the way it was explained to us is that the councils who were sort of preparing their maps in conjunction with the CFS, they might look at their area and go, well, we're worried about bushfire up to here, the other side of that road or whatever, we're not worried. Okay, so a lot of the council said, look, let's make this an assessment area. This is the bit we're worried about. We'll do a site assessment on every job just to work out what the risk is, and then we'll work out whether we need tanks and that sort of thing. Across that line, nothing. That makes perfect sense to me. So you've got an area that you want to look at it site by site. You get to a certain point on the map, nothing on the other side. Someone decided to call that assessment area high. And it sounds like a simple thing. I wish they'd called it assessment area and non-assessment or something like that. So because it was called high, someone then decided, well, that must mean a high bushfire risk. So we better put in this great big tank. All right? And then it seems really crazy to have a high bushfire risk next to something where you do nothing. So we'll put in a buffer zone. So if they'd called it assessment zone and then excluded, I think it would have been a lot simpler because people would have said, right, we'll assess this and that stuff we're not worried about. But the word high, I think, is what threw everything out. So in an excluded zone, be really careful. If you're within 500 metres of high, you need to do something. Okay? I've even messed up my own chart, to be honest, but there you go. So if you are between 100 metres and 500 metres from the high zone, you're classed as BAL low, which is a little bit irrelevant because, as I said, at the moment there are no construction requirements for BAL low. So last year you would have had to do something. Not much, but something. So in effect we've said you're excluded, but you're in the buffer zone, but you don't have to do anything. Which goes back to my comment before about if this makes sense, then you've missed it. All right, the one that really gets complicated for people. If you're within 100 metres of the high zone, you need to do a site assessment to work out your BAL rating, to work out what you do with the house. Okay? The scenario that we hate to see is that you designers go off and design something, you've rung up the council and they've said, oh no, you're in the excluded zone, don't worry. Because typically when you ring up council, you're talking to a planner. So under planning in the excluded zone, there are no requirements. So what they're telling you is quite right. But they've just said to you, you're excluded, don't do anything. So you go back to your client and go, we don't have to do anything. It's great. Get your planning consent, you come and see us. And we go, sorry, you're within 100 metres of high. You now need to do a site assessment. You go, oh no, what's that going to be? Don't know. How long does that take? 6 weeks. I told the owners we're going to start in 2. So the worst scenario is you've got all the way through that you're about to start and someone says you need to do a site assessment, it's got to go to the CFS. They could come back with BAL low, which would be good. They might come back and say BAL 29, which means at the very least your client's costs just went up by several thousand because they're now doing all these extra things to their house. Or you're going back to redesign the house. So that's the bit that gets embarrassing, to be honest. Not for us, because I just told you all about it. But when you're sitting there telling your client that you're just getting building consent, should be done within a couple of weeks, ready to go, and then you go back and say, we missed it, all right, that's not nice. So does that sort of make sense? So we've got tank requirements and construction requirements, but it's that overall sort of process that we're trying to explain. Yeah? Oh, that's good. It's taken me about 10 goes to get that chart right. But yeah, it's sort of got easier but more confusing now. There's nothing in Bow Low. Sorry, yep.
Is the CFS assessor, are they trained and do they have a cost associated with it?
The cost is part of your planning fees because it's a formal referral to the CFS. If it's this one. So you've lodged your application to council, it's in a high zone, council has to send it to the CFS, it's part of their costs. If you're on this one, I think someone's quoted to me the cost is like $180 or something. But the trick with this is no one's done anything yet, unless you've remembered. So this one's a bit easier. You go to council, council organises it all, they just tell you what the answer is. Okay, but this one is right at the end of the line where everybody's forgotten about it, and we go, you need a site assessment. So just be really careful with that one. One thing I want to talk about today too is alternative solutions or performance solutions. Does anyone know what I mean by that? A few nods. Okay. Really simply, a performance solution is the ability to, I won't say bend the rules, but to look at the rules in a slightly different way and perhaps change what the building code says. This is really, again, really complicated because this is actually not in the building code. All right, this is a minister specification. So I'm just talking words. It's still legislation, but it's not actually a change to the building code. So if you can imagine that when council first did their plans, as I was saying before, they've got this imaginary line where they say this side of the line we want to look at bushfire, the other side of the line we're not worried. In most cases that means if you're this side of the line, you're probably not too bad. Okay? So even though it's been called high, you might find that when you go to the CFS, it's come in at Bow Low or Bow 12.5, which is at the bottom end of the risk category, if you like. So normally, Bow 12.5, if you're in a medium, construction details are Bow 12.5, firefighting is a 5,000 litre tank, or a 2,000 litre tank. If you're in the low one, same thing, small tank. But in this one, the word on the map says high. You might have a site assessment that comes in as low or 12.5. So the actual risk is fairly low. But the legislation says you need a 22,000 litre tank and a pump and fire hoses and CFS fittings. $5,000, I think, is what we generally get told. Plus the fact of where do you put a 22,000 litre tank on a 400 square metre site. So there is a process where we can apply to the CFS for them to review this, and on a site-by-site basis, they quite often come back and say, well, yes, you're in the area where you need this size tank, but we've done a site assessment and it's come in at the bottom end of the scale, so we'll actually agree to a smaller tank. So there is a process that you can go through. Don't always assume that's guaranteed, but if you're in a metropolitan type area, and there are metro areas that are called high, there's a good chance the CFS will agree to a smaller tank. And that then becomes a performance solution, which is us sort of saying, that's what the legislation says. CFS are the experts, they said you can have a smaller one, so we'll go with that. Is that really confusing people again? We're all good?
Does the smaller tank still have to have all the CFS fittings?
No. Basically what the CFS do, there's a formal process where we can apply to the CFS and they say, look, the risk is probably one of these, so why don't we make the tank the same requirements for the medium and the general zones, which is just a tank with a tap. Some of that may be changing. I believe there's steps afoot where they might have 4 or 5 different options for tanks, which will make things more confusing. But that will depend on the size of the allotment. And there might be, a 10,000 litre tank and a 15,000 litre tank. So a few other options, which again, is probably going to complicate things, but you might look at it and go, oh, that sort of makes sense. But some of these high sites, if you ever get a chance to look at some of the bushfire maps, the bottom of Darlington, the bottom of South Road is high bushfire. but the sites are... usually when you think high bushfire, you think, up in the hills somewhere or, rural type properties, but there's quite a number of what you'd call metropolitan areas that are high, which just doesn't make sense. All good?
What would happen if someone didn't put the fittings on? Like, does someone check it? Or like, what happens if you...
There's a couple of answers I could give you there. I don't know who goes out and checks some of these things. My big fear, and I'm a little bit cynical these days, if you're at a site that was supposed to have a tank with CFS fittings and things, and let's hope we don't have any big bushfires, but let's say there's a fire goes through and your house burns down, and the insurance company sort of start looking into things and find out that, well, there was a CFS truck in the street. Oh yeah, but we couldn't get any water out of the tank because the tank wasn't there or the fittings weren't. I'll be really curious to know what the insurance companies would say. I'm not wanting that for anyone. But yeah, we hear stories where there's quite a number of a few subdivisions that are all supposed to have tanks, but they don't. And it's the old story. The first person didn't put one in, so the neighbour's not going to do it. It doesn't affect what we do, and I suppose I can put my head in the sand a little bit. We approve what's on the plan. So if the plan shows all this stuff and tells us all the right things, that's what we approve. It's up to the owner, builder, contractors to do it. And if they don't, well, I suppose it's no different to anything else. They're not building what they've got approval for.
So they have rules imposed on fit the tanks with the SAR requirements or that, but how is about requirement for maintaining the tanks, make sure they have waters?
Yeah, well, I suppose that's the same as everything. The requirement is that this water needs to be available all the time. So if you've got a 22,000 litre tank and you want to water your garden with it, then you need to make it bigger than 22,000, right? Because that should be 22,000 litres there all the time, ready for firefighting. Okay, and that's quite common. Some of you may be aware that, some councils have stormwater requirements where they want you to put in a detention tank. So the water comes off the roof, you hold it in a tank, it slowly goes out to the street. There's also a requirement under the building code that your downpipes need to be connected to a 1,000 litre tank, which is then connected to the toilet for flushing the toilet. So if council's got, say, 2,000 litre requirement for detention, there's 1,000 litres for the toilet and maybe 2,000 for bushfire, you can put in a 5,000 litre tank. It gets a bit tricky where all the fittings and things go because the bottom 2,000 has to be there all the time. So the bottom bit, have one tap out from there which goes to the toilet for the next 1,000 up, and then you might have 2,000 above that. So I'm sure the plumbers have a great time working out some of these things. So you can theoretically combine tanks. Some of the really sort of rural properties which don't have mains water, they might have 80,000 litres on site, but there'll be a specific tank just for bushfire. Or they might have a 50,000 litre tank and halfway up is their fitting and at the bottom is the CFS fitting. So they can use the top bit and the bottom bit stays there. So is that good? Should point out too, the common thing, one of the common questions we get asked, can I use a poly tank? Our answer is no. That may change with the new legislation that comes out, but at the moment the tank needs to be non-combustible, and we haven't got anything to say that a poly tank is not combustible. So, having said that, I believe the CFS don't mind because apparently poly tanks only melt down to the waterline. So if they're fighting a fire and the tank is right down to here, then they need to be getting out of there. If the tank's still pretty good. Mind you, I would think, particularly in this area, if you've got a fire that has just melted your rainwater tank, I probably think you shouldn't be standing there with a bucket trying to put it out. So this is one of those you should be down at Glenelg or somewhere. So high zone, this is for CFS water and the owners, this is for the owners, that's for the owners, and that's just to confuse everybody. All right. So we're all good? So with the actual construction details for the house, that has actually got a lot simpler. There is an Australian standard, 3959, which runs through how you build your house to make it resistant to bushfire. Again, I'm not going to say bushfire proof, that's exactly not what we're trying to say. And it's all to do with preventing sparks and things getting into the building. Okay? It used to be an Australian standard, but via the building code, the South Australian amendments to the building code would pluck different parts of the standards from different bits. Right, so that's changed. So it's really simple. You just go straight to the standard and you can read it. Okay. So I could confuse you, but it's history, so don't worry about it. So if you get the latest copy of the 3959, it's pretty simple. If you're in a BAL 12.5, you can just open it up and read what you need to do. So it covers things from subfloor, walls, windows, doors, roofs, all sorts of things. All good? So I've either confused everybody or everyone's happy. All right, good. So that's bushfire, I think. If anyone is thinking and wants to come back to that, we can. So the other thing I was asked to run through, which we sort of touched on there, I'm not sure if you've seen the same information that I've got, but the concept of doing alternative solutions, or we're now calling them performance solutions under the building code. Traditionally, the good old days we called them alternative solutions, and sorry, I'm old, I still use the old terms because I can't keep changing my mind. A performance solution or an alternative solution was done fairly rarely and only on commercial buildings, okay? And it was usually a case of where a building just didn't meet, or it wasn't sensible to apply the building code requirements to that particular building or the way it was going to be used. One example I like to use, I did a foundry building a few years ago. So if you want to analyse a foundry in accordance with the building code, it's a big industrial shed. And by the requirements of the code, a shed that size needed sprinklers, just simply because it was big, it's an industrial shed, needs sprinklers. One thing that was very quickly pointed out to me, that this is a foundry. So a foundry has basically got a big molten thing in the middle which is full of molten steel. And they pour that into moulds and do whatever they do. And it was very quickly explained that if you put water on top of molten steel, you get one very big bang, and you go and pick up the bits of the building from about a 5 kilometre radius. So that was a case where the use of the building just made the building code requirement silly, because the last thing they want is for sprinklers to go off in a foundry building. So if we go back to what the building code says, it's got performance requirements. So at the start of all the parts in the building code, it tells you what that part of the code is trying to achieve. So for fire safety, it talks about protecting the occupants, making sure the building stays suitable for them to evacuate, preventing the spread of fire from one building to another, keeping an environment that the fire brigade can turn up and actually fight a fire. So that's the performance requirements. The building then goes into what's called the the building code, then goes into the deemed to satisfy provisions, which tells you how to do that. And that's where it says for a building this big you need sprinklers. So if we look at the deemed to satisfy provisions for that foundry building and say, well, it's silly to put sprinklers in here because that's actually a bigger risk, how else do we manage those performance requirements? So how do we keep the building safe for people to get out? How do we stop the fire from spreading? And all those sorts of things. So for the particular foundry building, they just worked on a theory of additional alarm and detection systems. So if something goes wrong, they know about it sooner. There's always people in the building when the foundry's operating, so there's a whole series of manual points around the building that if someone sees something, they just hit the button, the alarms go off. Everybody gets out, the fire brigade come along and fight the fire just around the perimeter of the building. So effectively, we're not trying to put the molten steel bit out, we just protect around the outside of the building. So that was considered that it still achieved the ability for people to get out, preventing the fire spread, enabling the fire brigade to come along. So that's the performance requirements. So we haven't met the deemed to satisfy, we've met the performance requirements, so that's a performance solution for that building. Okay? And that's becoming more and more common. The concept here of not putting in a 22,000 litre tank, if you're in a BAL low or a BAL 12.5, is a performance solution. The code says I need to do this. But the CFS, who are the authority for fire, say that's silly, put in a smaller tank. That's a performance solution. We've still managed to provide water for the firefighting. We're keeping the owners safe. We're allowing the CFS to have the water they want because they're saying we don't really need water. So that is a performance solution. So they're becoming more and more common, particularly in commercial buildings. Okay, but we are getting a few for domestic. One of the examples that was sent to me from your lecturer talks about an existing domestic building that might be half a metre off the boundary. Have they seen this question? No? Okay. I'm not sure who I'm talking to. It's all right. So the example is that there's a building, a house 500 millimetres off a boundary. and they want to do an addition on the back, and they want to keep the wall in line. If we look at the requirements of the building code, there's a South Australian amendment which says to prevent the creation of spaces that you can't clean and can't get access to, buildings need to be 600 off the boundary. 600. And the whole point for that is so you don't build your house that far from the boundary and the weeds will grow and the local cats move in and rubbish gets in there and you can't get in there to clean it. So the requirement is 600 off or on the boundary. Does that sort of make sense? But if you've got an existing building half a metre off the boundary and you want to keep that in line, on one hand you'd say, oh, that makes sense. And on the other hand you'd say, well, that's not 600 mil. So we can go through a process of saying, okay, if it's not 600, can we agree to 500? So we've done this on a few jobs where you might look at it and go, okay, let's concrete that area so we're not going to get weeds. I'm not sure about these days, but I reckon I can get down 500 mil with a broom and a rake and clean it. So the difference of 100 mil wasn't considered major, and we have in the past done a performance solution to allow building 500 mil off the boundary instead of 600. If it came in at 300, that's about 300, we'd probably say differently because you can't get in there to clean it. But in that sort of scenario, you might actually build something that actually seals that whole area in so that you can't get access for anything. So again, that would be an alternative solution or a performance solution. Yep.
If a building does use alternative materials or design principles, what do you want to see as a certifier on the plans or drawings?
For alternative materials,
Or designs or solutions?
we still need to make sure it meets the performance requirements of the building code. So alternative forms of construction aren't a problem as long as you can prove that it meets the requirement. And it's a really good topic at the moment. I'm trying to think how to summarise it really simply though. I'll pick on foam cladding. Do you know what I mean by foam cladding? I'm not going to use brand names. There is some foam cladding around which is sort of manufactured under quality conditions. It's been tested whether it meets Australian standards and the requirements of the code as far as weatherproofing, termite protection, durability, all those sorts of things. So if you've got a product that, I'll say foam cladding, that's gone through that process and has got test reports, or quite often they have what's called a code mark certificate, that basically shows that the product's been tested and meets Australian requirements or the requirements of the building code for how you want to use it, you can use it. If you've imported something from overseas and it's just landed off a ship and it looks foamy and white and you want to put it on your building, no. And that's a real issue at the moment. I'm not picking on foam cladding specifically, but I had a chap come in the office a few months back. He says he's introducing all this, or he's bringing all this product over from overseas, I won't mention the country, that he wants to use on the building. And I say, well, have you got any test reports? And he goes, yes. And he hands it to me, and it's all in Chinese. I said, well, that's great. I still can't say yes. But it's a real problem. The issue of non-complying materials is, I think, probably going to be the biggest thing, particularly for some of you guys. The building code's pretty straightforward. It's black and white, you can read it, you can interpret it. Non-complying materials is really tricky, particularly if you're designing or project managing a project. We hear all sorts of wonderful stories. We go to a building surveyors conference every year, and there's a chap there from an organisation which basically quality checks steel. So if you're making steel in Australia, you need to be a member of a certain organisation, and the bits of steel that come out of that factory, you can guarantee what it is, the quality of the steel. I don't pretend to be a metallurgist, if that's the right word, but you can mix all sorts of stuff in steel to make steel with different properties, whether you want it to be stronger or more bendable or whatever. If you make structural steel beams out of melted down Coke cans, it won't achieve what Australian standards need it to achieve. So there's a whole heap of steel that apparently is coming into the country that hasn't got that sort of testing, but it's being sold. Apparently there was one load of steel that went from state to state because it got rejected at one and went to the next one, and I'm not sure where it ended up going. But that's really scary. If you're designing a project or you're a project manager on a job, your engineer designs, I'll keep saying steel, your engineer designs the steel to have a certain strength. Now if the steel that you're being supplied looks the same, feels the same, it's probably got the same writing on the side because they're pretty good at copying that as well, but it's only half the weight. Something's dodgy. I should be careful, I'm being recorded, aren't I? So just be really careful. So the issues with non-conforming products basically relates to, is the product being used for what it was intended to be used for? And is it actually a suitable product? And is it being installed correctly? Okay, and there are probably three things to be really careful of. We see glossy magazines and glossy brochures and things arrive all the time, or details on plans that specifies products. Jump on a website and try and do your homework. So a lot of these products don't have any testing to back them up, don't have anything to say they're actually suitable to be used for what people want to use them for. And it's not your fault, it's not my fault. The people bringing, I won't mention the hardware store, but there was a hardware store selling, we would see notes on a plan for a pool fence, and it would give us a brand name and details, and quite often there'd be a brochure of a nice picture of a pool with a screen. You do your homework and, oh no, this is not pool fencing, this is just glass panels we're selling. So, okay. So just, I'm not sure how much of that I can say. So people might say, no, they don't say that it complies with the Australian standard, but they sell it to you on the basis that there's a brochure of a swimming pool with a fence in front of it, and they're selling it to you as a piece of glass. How you use it is up to you. So the liability issues around that are crazy. So I'm not trying to scare everybody, but there you go. So I had some questions from, is it Michael's class? So I'm happy to run through these, or if whoever's asked the question, sorry? Yeah.
Can I just ask a question about the deemed to satisfy? So as a private certifier, you are the ones that either accept or reject
The deemed to performance solution is up to us, yes. The process for that is, I'll say, toughening up a little bit. Particularly in relation to fire, traditionally it would be a case that we might get a report from a fire consultant. And this is going to sound very simplistic, but it's a bit like the fire consultant saying, oh, look, this doesn't seem reasonable, this seems like a good solution, we reckon this is the way to go. It's very simplistic, but that's what they say. In the building code now, there is a detailed process for how you actually justify a performance solution, but ultimately it's up to us.
So if you were doing a development application not using a private certifier, in that case you would have to go through that process, or can you still do that just through council?
It's the same process. So when I say certifier, so certifier as the approving authority for building rules, which could be council as well, so certifier or council. So we're technically going through the same process. So if you want to do a performance solution, you need to justify to us. So something like the example of building your house 500 mil off the boundary compared to 600 mil is probably something we just have a chat and say, oh, we reckon this is fair, and you know, there's probably not going to be a great detailed report written on it. Something like that foundry building, we'd expect to see a fire engineering report nowadays. But that fire engineering report would need to be formatted a certain way to address the issues that are now outlined in the building code. So the building code now has a fairly detailed process for how you go about justifying a performance solution. And that flows across to other things, which I'll get to in one of these questions in a minute. So, so the one question I had, which we've probably covered, I hope, the most common mistake with regards to compliance and building in a bushfire prone area is that. Probably the logical things out of that is the excluded zone and the requirement to have access for the CFS truck. There's no point having your tank right down the back where the truck can't get to it. Another thing just to be wary of, there is a requirement in AS 3959 which talks about providing fire protection for something that might be next to a flat surface. So the simple example for that is if you've got the front wall of the house with full height windows and it goes down to a veranda or a paved area, in the event of a fire, you're going to have sparks and burning leaves and sticks and things all blowing up on your veranda. They blow up against the wall, set fire to the windows or break the glass or whatever. So the AS 3959 actually specifies or considers that as a flat surface. So it's really easy to think of something like a veranda or the outside paving. If you look at the definition of the flat surface though, it refers to a projection of 110 mil on an angle of less than, I think it's 5 degrees, which can include brick seals or something simple like a parapet Or you might have a nice little decorative feature that sticks out at floor level, or a veranda roof or something like that. So sometimes just be really careful of your detailing, particularly because most of the fire rating requirements are based on the fact of where the sparks and embers are going to build. So a lot of the stuff in AS 3959 talks about the bottom 400 mil of a wall. So you need to protect the bottom part of the wall, but not the top part. But if you then build something that's flat in the middle, then you're doing from there up as well. Okay, so that's a bit of a weird concept, but some people get really confused when we say, well, how are you going to protect above that window ledge or something like that? So just be aware, a lot of people actually specify the angle of their brick seals in bushfire areas, which I don't think you do it anywhere else. So the other question, what are the most common compliance issues and how can they be avoided? Most of what I do is residential work, and most people that are doing the designs know what they're doing. I don't get too many jobs where you have a plan in front of you and say, that doesn't meet the building code, go away, start again. But usually it's a matter of either someone hasn't given us enough information, or someone has made some changes but that hasn't followed through the design process, or the details just don't match. Really simple example, your architectural plans show that it's a sheet roof, and then when I get the roof framing plan it says it's a tiled roof. That's really simple. And that might sound like a simple example, but that's what most of my job is, just trying to match things up. So again, someone might have a plan which they suddenly decide to move a wall or make some changes to it, forgot to tell the engineer, so then when we get the footing details in, I've got that house, that footing, and they don't match. And it might be really simple, but if they don't match, they don't match.
Yeah, so those questions that I sent through to you there, they were from a couple of students, and there's a couple others that have got their questions on there. So
Okay.
it might be a good idea to let some of the students ask some of those questions as well.
All right, sure. All right, there was a couple on here. There was a good one. Wet areas and disability. So I assume that it's in relation to commercial buildings with disabled toilets and that sort of thing. What we would expect to see on a plan are certainly things like the layout of the building, the number of toilets, access to the toilets, and those sorts of things, all complying with the Australian Standard 1428, which is the disabled access one. Just be really careful, because if you're looking at a commercial building with toilets for people with disabilities, I have to apologise, I keep using the shortened version. It is really detailed to the point of view that the location of the toilet pan needs to be within about a tolerance of 10 mil. The types of door handles, the types of tap handles, the width of the hand basin, clearances around all your facilities, even where the toilet paper holder goes, grab rails, types of pretty much everything in the toilet. There is a requirement in that standard. So as a designer's point of view, you can either draw a rough layout and go, well, I think the builder will work it out on site. And if you're project managing that job, maybe you can keep an eye on it. But if you've simply handed those plans to a builder and the builder's not really, really competent in what they're doing, you're probably going to have a problem. And they are exactly the sorts of things that people will go and look at, run over with a fine-tooth comb, measure, because it's all black and white in the standard what you're supposed to do. But it's really common where you go out and the plumber goes, yeah, the toilet, yeah, that's about right, yeah, whatever. It's only got to be 10 mil out and it's wrong. And usually you find out it's wrong when the whole room's finished, probably the day before handover, and you go, sorry, we've got to come back and completely redo your toilet. So I'd always suggest put as much information as you can on the plan, particularly for facilities for people with disabilities. Also, don't forget the requirements for what's called an ambulant toilet. So you're probably all familiar with, you've got your traditional run-of-the-mill toilets, you've got your traditional toilet for people with disabilities, which are the larger rooms. You've also got a requirement now where you've got multiple toilets to have at least one toilet facility that someone in a walking frame or someone with that sort of mobility impairment can get in and use. So that usually means a larger cubicle and also a bit more room outside the cubicle.
Can you combine that with the accessible one?
No, you can combine the ambulant one with the traditional type toilets. It just means you've probably got one room a little bit bigger. And again, that's one of those things, if you think about it right at the start and design your toilet, it fits in pretty easily. If you're trying to go back there the day before handover and go, oh crap, I've got to find a space this big inside and outside the toilet, it won't work. That's why we ask questions. So that covers that one. Someone's asked questions about underfloor heating. I'll be really blunt, I don't care. It does affect your energy rating. Your engineer might want to know something about it with construction details for your floor, but as far as a building code issue, I'm not fussed. There wasn't stairs. Stairs is probably my biggest problem at the moment. There's two general things that we look at for stairs. One is what I call the geometry of the stair, and then we've got the construction of the stair. When I say stair, I mean balustrade as well. So the geometry of the stair covers things like your riser height, your going length, gaps between the treads, the height of the handrail, the height of the balustrade, gaps in the balustrade, those sorts of things. That's reasonably simple, okay, and I'd expect that information to be on the plan. Also a note about non-slip. Right, there's some very specific requirements about non-slip requirements for stairs these days. And a wise building surveyor once said to me, people don't slip at the bottom step of the stairs, they always slip at the top. So then they go dum 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 dum. And that's when the insurance companies come knocking on the door going, what on earth have you approved? Or what have you designed? Or what have you built? And I know that's a weird way of looking at things, but people get hurt when stairs aren't right. You can mess up your underfloor heating and it doesn't really affect too many things. If you mess up your stairs, people get hurt. So that's how we think about it. So the geometry of the stairs, the geometry of the balustrades is pretty straightforward. The thing that I'm finding really difficult at the moment is actually getting details about complying balustrades, which comes back to what we were saying before about types of products. There are a number of balustrade manufacturers in Australia. Some of their products are very good. A lot of them have done extensive testing, and you can get on their website and you can get 155 pages of details of exactly how it all goes together. So you'll have a balustrade, and it'll tell you it's got to be 1 metre high and the posts need to be 1200 apart and it's glass and that. But then someone decides they want to put the posts at 1.5 metre centre. So from our point of view, quite often we get the test reports come in and we will read them, and then we look at the plan and we go, well, that balustrade isn't that balustrade. I had one the other day, it was an aluminium balustrade with aluminium slats. They send me a test report for a glass balustrade. It's funny, isn't it? But then they sit there and go, why haven't you approved it? I said, well, it's not the same balustrade. I won't tell you what else we said, but there you go. There's also seems to be a bit of a trend at the moment where people want to design their own balustrade for their own building. They've got this lovely 2-3 story building and they want a lovely staircase. That's fine, no problems. But if you're not selecting a balustrade that is a tested sort of system, someone needs to design that balustrade. You can't just sit there and go, well, I think I'll put a post there and a post there and a couple of screws and a rail and put a panel in. That'll be all right. No. So you need to get an engineer to design that, or come up with some way of me being comfortable that it meets the Australian standards. So there's a whole range of requirements for the Australian standard about how strong that balustrade needs to be, how it will resist the load of someone falling on it and those sorts of things. So if I saw a job the other day, lovely staircase, looks fantastic, but the description of the balustrade was one line. It said steel posts, tubular handrail, glass infill. Can I have approval, please? No. So I don't know why that's so hard. So if you're designing jobs with balustrades and your client wants their own balustrades, so what I mean by that is their own design, sort of a one-off, I think bespoke is the word we're supposed to use these days, they need to design it, not just toss a coin and go, I think I'll put posts here and do whatever. I don't know why that's so hard at the moment, but that's the bane of my life some days. So. All right, that's probably covered the main questions on there. Fire them at me. How are we going for time? Are we right for time?
Question. Those who are needing to attend timber framing code, now after those schools,
I was a carpenter, I can answer your questions. No, that's all right, if I've made them late. I can keep going, but I know it's supposed to.
When certifying plans in bushfire zones,
Yep.
do you just rely on just a simple site plan that shows like trees
For doing the site assessment, do you mean? Or-
If you just say someone's in a medium bushfire zone and they've given you the plans to certify, do you prefer to have detailed photos of what the site is like, access?
No, because in medium, so that, when I say medium, that's on a council plan.
Yep.
So the council has said this area is medium. So from my point of view, that automatically becomes BAL 12.5. Doesn't matter if your site's covered in trees, grass, concrete or whatever. If the council plan says it's medium, it's medium. So that's it. So that's one of those that's non-negotiable. If we're talking about one where we do a site assessment, we don't do the assessment. So typically, I'll sort of answering your question in a weird way. If we're approaching the CFS about the tank requirements, so if we're in one of these sites that says it's high bushfire, we need a big tank, but the actual BAL ratings come in pretty low, the information that we would send the CFS would include aerial photos, if we know where the street main is, so is there a street plug out the front they can use, they want to know what that area is like, and then they'll do a site assessment on that. As far as doing the site assessment to determine the BAL level, again, we'd strongly suggest the CFS do it, but it needs to be considered. I think it's up to about half a kilometre all the way around the site. They'll look at the vegetation, whether you're on the side of a hill or whatever. I can't probably say it strong enough, get the CFS to do the site assessment. Years ago, we used to get a few engineers would do it, and the standard is the concept of the standard is quite simple. You measure the trees, you measure the grass, you work out how far it is, and there's a bit of a graph. But when does grass become shrubs, and when does shrubs become trees, and when is scrub, when does it become bush? So you could look at it and go, yeah, there's a few trees, but then you've got to try and put it into a table and work it out. So we found that for those sites that had engineers, for example, doing a site assessment, they'd always be a little bit more conservative than the CFS. Simply because they're trying to look at a tree and interpret that to a standard. The CFS, I think, have a slightly different theory on how they look at it, or maybe it's just more experience, I don't know, but I think most people doing a site assessment will err on the side of caution. I'm not saying the CFS aren't being careful or not doing the right thing. I think the CFS do a very good job, but they always seem to come up with slightly less of a BAL rating. So if you had the CFS assess the site and someone else assessed the site and they came up with different answers, I don't think I've yet had one where the CFS wasn't the low one.
Is that because the CFS isn't trained like what we are to building code and everything?
I think it's because the CFS fight fires. We sit at a desk and go, well, the code says that's a tree, whereas the CFS, we did a site, when that standard first came out, we did a site visit up through the hills where we literally got on a bus and went round to all sorts of sites with the guy from the CFS. And we got out at one site and the trees were this far apart and we all looked at it and said, crap, that's got to be flame zone of 40. The CFS guy said, no, it's probably about 19. And we all, because we're all looking at this map or a chart in the standard, trying to look at, whereas he sits at it and goes, well, yeah, there's lots of trees, but the foliage is right up there. There's nothing under it, so how is it going to... So they've got that extra sort of knowledge and understanding of a fire.
So there's nothing to stop, say, one of us joining the CFS, doing our training, fighting a couple of fires and then going, oh yeah, we can do this.
No, when I say the CFS, there's a specific branch of the CFS that do that.
Yeah, that's what I was
Their
asking.
development assessment unit. Yeah, sorry. We occasionally get people that come into the office and say, oh, I've got a mate who's in the CFS, he's done it for me. And we go, that's nice, go and talk to the other guys. No disrespect intended, but if we're going to rely on it, we want it coming from the people within the CFS who are actually trained and authorised to do that. So I actually would say they've got more knowledge than anyone else, and that's why they might get slightly different answers. But I've never looked at one and gone, actually no, I did have one where I looked at it and said, I don't agree with that, and I found out they'd looked at the wrong site. I've only ever had one where I've looked at it and gone, oh, I think that's a bit weird. That's because they were given the wrong details for what site it was. So. Sorry, I think. Yeah.
Is there possible to change the bushfire zone in a couple of years, and what impact it would cause in the buildings that already exist there?
Okay. This level, so the high, medium, general and excluded is in the council development plan. So councils review their development plan. I think legally they have to do it every 5 years, I think it is. I don't know if council's are actively looking at changing that or not, but there's potentially they can, yes. As far as a house, if a house was built 3 years ago and the bushfire zone changes, you don't need to go back and change the house. One thing you do need to be aware of, if you're doing alterations and additions to a house in a bushfire zone and you're increasing the floor area by more than 50%, then we need to look at that whole house from a bushfire point of view. So that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to pull the whole house down and rebuild it to meet the new standards, but it might be something really simple. If the existing windows don't have screens, then how about we put screens on the window? So that's something you could do as part of an addition. If you're taking the roof off, let's make sure all the roof complies. So it's really a matter of us seeing what level of upgrade you can do to make it safer. It gets really weird because you might have a house that was built in 1950 with no bushfire protection at all. If you put a little addition on the side, that has to comply. The weirdest example I ever had was a little log cabin up in, I think it was Kaipo Forest, and it literally looked like a little log cabin in Kaipo Forest. And they wanted to build an ensuite. The ensuite is flame zone. So that had to be concrete. So there's a log cabin, I think it was Kaipo, there's a log cabin with a concrete ensuite. I didn't say it made sense, but that's what the legislation said I had to do. I can't demand the existing building be upgraded, and I don't know how you could anyway. But that just seemed like the silliest example I'd ever seen. But.
Yep. So you're talking about they can have a smaller water tank if the CFS sets in a suite. Is there any other aspects you change depending on what the CFS have said to you?
No. No, because the CFS are the authority for firefighting, so they're commenting on the fire water. So again, this is where this gets confusing because you've got planning issues and building issues. So we're trying to vary the planning requirements for the size of the tank. I don't think we've ever had a case where we've looked at the bushfire protection for a building and then tried to downgrade it. There's a few sites where, there used to be one site up in the hills where someone would come in about every 12 months, so I've just got this great site, it's bargain, I can't believe the views, it's on top of a hill, there's all these trees, it's fantastic. I said, you had a site assessment done? Not yet, but we've got the house all planned. They'd come back, it's flame zone. You'd never hear from them again. 12 months later, someone comes in, I've just bought this block of land up in the hills, it's fantastic. So there's some sites that just have problems. If you've got a property that once you've done your site assessment, it gets a bit scary or you can't do what you want with the house, I quite seriously say to people, do you have a chainsaw? In some areas you've got native vegetation which you can't cut down trees, but a lot of sites you cut down 1 or 2 trees, your bushfire rating might change 2 levels. It might just be that one tree right next to the house that tips you over to the next rating. So I'm not suggesting we all go out there and cut down every tree in town, but if you've got a job that might just sneak into flame zone, which means you're looking at a lot of design issues, a lot of material issues, a lot of cost, you might be able to move the house 50 metres, or you might be able to cut down a tree, or talk to the CFS. And quite often they'll say, look, if you move it over there and do this and do that, well, then the level will come down. The CFS are good. They're not there to try and stop you from doing things. They just want to try and keep you safe. So, yep.
Planning is a big buzzword today. The changes that are coming in January, could you give us an explanation of what?
No. I don't pretend to understand it. My general view is that they're trying to get a process all electronic where applications are submitted to one common portal through Department of Planning, Transport, Industry, and then the applications get filtered out to councils, and I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know. I think, as far as I know, the councils are still going to be the responsible authority for planning matters. There are some cases now where you can get planning matters certified independently, like privately certified, but there's fairly strict controls over that. When I say strict, it means that if you've got, oh, don't quote me, I'm not talking planning terms, if you've got a reasonable size allotment and you're building a reasonable house and it's not, great big walls on boundaries and it's not, the design is unlikely to upset neighbours and you've got enough open space and it's set back from the street and all these things are spelled out in a sort of a checklist. If you meet all of those things, then you can get your house approved privately. You don't need to go to council. Once you don't meet those requirements, so I think one of them is a wall on the boundary no more than 6 metres long, I think. So if you want an 8 metre garage on the boundary, then you can't get it privately certified, you're off to council. So I think, I mean, that seems like a good process, I think, that if you've got a fairly simple, a fairly straightforward development, can get done privately. There's a bit of a history where certifies bag councils all the time. It's like South Australia, Victoria and Australia, New Zealand. I think councils are the ones that should be doing planning consent, personally. They know the area, they know what their local area needs, what it wants. I think that's the right people to do it. Sometimes we hear stories where you wonder why things take so long. But the new process, as I understand it, is a central portal for lodging applications. The date for implementation keeps getting set back. They were looking at implementing it for what's called the out of council areas, which are basically right up sort of the mid-north. I think they have, all those areas combined have a total of about 50 applications a year. So I think the theory was they'll get that implemented first, try that for about 6 months, then they'll implement it for the outer metro areas, and then finally for the inner metro. But I haven't looked into it in great detail. I'm not sure why or what the benefits are supposed to be. Okay. Thank you.